Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Welcome, everybody. So good to have you guys here today at all three of our Parker Hill locations. And if you're here for the very first time, let me just tell you it's a great weekend to be in church because today we're beginning a brand new teaching series, and it's always good to jump in at the very beginning of a new teaching series. But today and for the rest of the month of February, we're just going to be walking through one book of the Bible, the book of Jonah. Now, the book of Jonah, the story of Jonah, is one of those parts of the Bible that even if you don't have a church background, you at least know bits and pieces of the story. And some of you right now might be thinking, yeah, the story of Jonah, I know about the story of Jonah. That's the story about the big fish. But the story of Jonah, the book of Jonah, isn't a story about a fish, although there is a fish in the story. We'll get to that in a few minutes. There is a fish, but that's not the point of the story. Because the story of Jonah is the story of a man who ran from God and a God who loved him so much that he pursued him even to the ends of the earth. And the story of Jonah is really your story, and it's my story as well. A few years ago, I was visiting my parents in Seattle when they lived there. And I had planned while I was out there in Seattle to hike Mount Rainier, which is just a couple of hours south of the city of Seattle. And so while I was out there and the day before I went on that hiking trip, my mom gave me an article from the local newspaper and told me to read it. And of course, it was an article about a hiker who almost died. So that's why she wanted me to read it. But I thought it was a fascinating article from the Seattle Times, and it goes like this. A hiker is stranded in South America's Andes Mountains when a blizzard begins. He reaches into his backpack for his cell phone, only to find his prepaid minutes are up. The mountaineer slowly begins freezing to death, surviving for 24 hours with his only warmth coming from carefully measured doses of brandy. Then suddenly, at above 12,500 feet, Leonard Diaz hears a familiar ring. Out of nowhere, a telemarketer is calling on his cell phone, asking him if he would like to buy more minutes. The Bell South operator kept calling Leonard to keep him awake and help him ward off hypothermia. He was able to keep talking to her until rescue teams arrived 7 hours later. Interesting story, but that story reminds me that sometimes I think we treat God as a telemarketer. He's trying to get our attention. He's trying to get through to us, and we think his motive is just to make our lives difficult. But God is trying to reach out to us and get our attention, to call us back to himself, to live according to his plan so that we can live a life of blessing and fullness under God's protection and according to his wisdom. And the story of Jonah is the story about a man who ran from God and the God who relentlessly pursued him. And as strange as you may think the story of Jonah is, it's really your story. And it's my story as well, because at one time or another, all of us, to one degree or another, have tried to run from God. For some of you, and I don't mean that you ran from God physically and you moved to a different place like Jonah did, we'll talk about that. But for some of you, it may have looked like this. You grew up in church, but then you got into college or in your 20s, and you just decided that you had had enough of following God's wisdom and God's principles. And so you basically said, you know, God, I got a life to live. I got people to meet and places to go, so see you. And for years, you ran in the opposite direction, or at least walked in the opposite direction of God. And now you're just starting to come back. Maybe for others of you, running from God wasn't something that you did generally, but maybe just in one specific area of your life. Like you didn't abandon your faith, but maybe there was this one issue, this one area of your life where you just said, God, I know what you're calling me to do, but that's not what I'm going to do. Maybe someone in your life has hurt you deeply, and you know that God is calling you to forgive. But you say, God, you know I should forgive that person. I know you want me to forgive that person, but nobody else would ever forgive something like this. And it's just too difficult to forgive. So God, I know what you're calling me to do, but I'm not doing that. See, you're running from God. Maybe for you, it's simply that God, you sense, has been calling you to just really start living out your faith seriously, really become an all-in follower of Christ. But you know that that's going to cost you something. It's going to change your schedule, change your priorities, maybe require some sacrifice. And so you say, God, I know how you're calling me to live, but that's not how I want to live, so no thank you. You're running from God. Maybe for you it's a relational thing. Maybe you're dating somebody and you know what the Bible says and what God says to you about dating someone who's a believer, and you say, God, I know you want me to be dating a girl who's a Christian, but God, she's really, really cute, and she might become a Christian. And it's a lot easier to become a Christian than to become really, really cute. And so, God, I know what you're calling me to do, but I'm not going to do that. See, you're running from God. But here's what we need to remember. Whenever we run from God, our lives always get more complicated and more painful, because when you run from God, you turn your back on him and you turn away from the ultimate source of wisdom and truth. And whenever we turn our backs on God's wisdom, we always end up creating more pain for ourselves and for the people around us. What I've discovered over the years is that people who run from God, when they finally get done running, they have all kinds of financial problems or marriage problems or addiction problems. See, whenever you run from God, it's always going to make your life more complicated and more painful. But here's the other side of that, and what I really want you to remember today. And it's this, that no matter how far you run from God, he never stops pursuing you. In fact, if I could just kind of boil down and summarize everything we're going to talk about in this first message, I would summarize it this way, that you can run from God, but you can't outrun God. You can run from God, but you can't outrun God. And that, my friends, is a very good thing. So let's jump into the story of Jonah. There's 4 chapters in the book of Jonah. We're just going to take one chapter each week. So today we're going to start with chapter 1. And there's a spot on that connection card you filled out a few minutes ago where you can take some notes. And I would encourage you to read along with me as we go through chapter 1. The easiest way to do that is to bring up the passage on your Parker Hill app or some other Bible app. It'll be real easy to find that way, okay? So here we go, Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, and maybe it came to Jonah through a dream or a vision. We don't know how, but the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. And that's in there just to remind us that Jonah was a real person. This was not once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away. This was a real person with a real father who lived in a real place. And so God speaks somehow to Jonah and says, Jonah, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Now, Jonah was a Jewish prophet, as you may know, and the job of the prophet was to deliver a message on God's behalf. And normally a Jewish prophet would speak to the Jewish people, but this was a very different assignment because Jonah was being called to go to the city of Nineveh. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the city of Nineveh. The city of Nineveh is actually located about 500 miles northeast of Israel in what we know today as the country of Iraq. In fact, this is a satellite image of the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh just outside the city of Mosul in Iraq. And in its day, Nineveh was the largest city in the world in terms of population. And the city proper itself covered about 3 square miles. And there was a wall around the entire city. They've excavated parts of it. It was 50 feet tall, 40 feet wide. I mean, this was a very large, well-fortified, powerful city, which is why it's described in verse 1 as a great city. Now, something else to keep in mind is that the city of Nineveh was the capital city, the city of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians were, at that time, the most powerful nation on earth, and they were the enemies of the people of Israel. And so God was calling Jonah to go into enemy territory. And by the way, they were not nice enemies. You see, the Assyrians were known for their brutality. They were cruel, wicked people, and that is a well-documented fact in history. In fact, this is a carving that was found in the ruins of the city of Nineveh, depicting some of the ways that they would treat their enemies once they conquered a city. Like they would, while their enemies were still living, they would sometimes impale them on a pole outside the city walls. Or they would, amputate parts of their bodies, or they would They would take the heads of enemy soldiers after they'd killed them, and they would hang the heads of those enemy soldiers on the walls of a city just as a warning. You know, sometimes they would even chain them up and make them listen to Miley Cyrus albums for hours at a time. They were cruel people. That's where God was calling Jonah to go. I mean, this was an incredibly difficult assignment. In essence, God was saying, Jonah, I want you to travel 500 miles to the capital city of your enemies, the most brutal people on the face of the earth, and I want you to tell them to repent and turn to God. So let me ask you a question. What do you do when God says go to Nineveh? What do you do in your life when God says, here's where I want you to go, but you don't want to go there? When God says, here's how I want you to live, but you don't want to live that way. What do you do in that moment? Here's what Jonah did, verse 3. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now, you can't really appreciate this unless you see it on a map. So let me show it to you on a map. To get to Nineveh, Jonah would have had to travel, as I mentioned, about 500 miles to the northeast. Didn't need a boat to do that. He could have stayed on land. But here's what Jonah did instead. He goes all the way over here. Tarshish was as far as you could go in that day, at least in terms of shipping routes. It was the end of the world as they knew it, 2,500 miles away. It's as if Jonah was saying, listen, God, not only am I not going to go there, I am going to go in the opposite direction as far as I possibly can. And maybe, just maybe this is an illustration of your life right now. Because God says, I want you to go here. I want you to forgive that person. But you just double down on your bitterness. God says, I want you to love your wife and treat her tenderly, but you just continue to ridicule her and make her life difficult. God says, I want you to go here. I want you to be generous. But you just become more and more and more selfish. What do you do when God says, I want you to go to Nineveh? How do you respond to that? There was a time years ago when my oldest daughter was still very young, and I took her shopping, and she had been given some birthday money, so we went out to the store to spend it. And we got to the store, walked around for a little while, and she decided she wanted to buy a Barbie doll. Now, I wasn't real big into Barbie dolls as a parent, just a personal thing. It just wasn't something I wanted my girls to have, but she really wanted to buy a Barbie doll. But I said, honey, I'm sorry, no Barbie dolls today. And she said, well, Daddy, why can't I have a Barbie doll? And I said, well, sweetie, Barbie dolls can create narcissism because they emphasize external appearance at the expense of internal character, and I don't want that for you. Blank stare. Daddy, why can't I have a Barbie doll? And I said, I'm sorry, honey, you just can't have one. And she began to cry, and she said, Daddy, please, I want a Barbie doll. And I said, no, honey. And she began to reason with me. She said, but Daddy, it's my birthday money. And I said, that's true, honey, but it's my car that's going to be taking you home, and I don't take Barbie dolls in my car. And she tried everything she could try, and eventually she pulled the trump card. She said, okay then, Daddy, if you don't buy me a Barbie doll, then you can't be my daddy anymore. That's the way sometimes we relate to our Heavenly Father. Everything is fine in the relationship until God says, here's a boundary that I don't want you to cross, and you want to cross it until God says, here's what I'm calling you to do, and you don't want to do that. And we, in essence, say, God, I don't know. In this area, I don't want you to be my father anymore. Jonah says, God, I know what you're telling me to do, but I'm just not going to do that. And what's interesting? This could have been the end of the story right there. It's been a very short book of the Bible, but this could have been the end of the story. God could have said, well, I'm out of luck. There goes Jonah. He's on a ship. He's off to Tarshish. I guess I'll have to find somebody else. Could have been the end of the story. But here's the good news. God does not give up on us that easily. And God loved Jonah too much to just let him run. I want you to notice the first three words here in verse 4. What are the first three words? Then the Lord. And let me tell you something, whenever you're running from God, you're eventually going to come to then the Lord moment in your life. There are going to be times when God will do something to try to get your attention, to call you back to himself, because you can run from God, but you can't outrun God. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. Now, this had to be a serious storm because these sailors, they made their living on the sea. This was their home. This is what they were used to. They had seen plenty of storms before, but this storm was so bad, it gets these sailors praying to whatever God they could figure out to pray to. Not only were they praying, but then they did this, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Now, their entire livelihood was based on getting cargo from one point to another point. And so when the cargo went overboard, then their profit went overboard as well. And they were facing a financial catastrophe because of this. Do you know where Jonah was, though, when all this was happening? Look at the end of verse 5. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. That's so interesting to me. Let me tell you why that's so interesting to me, because every once in a while, I hear someone say something like this. They'll say, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I have such a sense of peace about it. And certainly, if God didn't want me to do this, then I wouldn't have such a sense of peace about this. In the words of my godly mother, do you know what that is? That is bologna sauce right there. Listen, you can have a sense of peace. Jonah had a sense of peace in the middle of a raging storm that frightened some really tough sailors. Sometimes a sense of peace is just a seared conscience or a hard heart. So God sends a storm, trying to get his attention. The storm wasn't enough to do it, and so God prompts the captain of the ship to go down to Jonah. The captain went down to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish. And the contrast here, the irony here is amazing. The sailor is telling the prophet that it's time to pray. And really, what I think was happening here is that I think God was speaking to Jonah through the voice of the captain of that ship. And God was saying to him, Jonah, wake up. Don't you see where you are? Don't you see what you're doing? Jonah, you're in the middle of a storm. Just wake up and turn to me. Call on me. Come back to me. Speaking of storms, about 10 years ago, there was a hurricane that swept through the middle of Florida. It was Hurricane Charlie. It was one of the strongest hurricanes in the history of the United States. Winds up to 150 miles per hour, all kinds of damage. And most of the signs and billboards that were in the path of the hurricane were destroyed. But there was a billboard in Orlando, Florida that survived the hurricane. But what the storm did was the storm peeled away the advertisement on the billboard and revealed an earlier message that had been underneath that one. And so when the sun came up the next morning in Orlando, Florida, here's what people saw on that billboard. We need to talk. God. And the truth is, there are times in our lives when we run in the opposite direction from where God is calling us to go. And when we run sometimes into the middle of a storm. And it may be a storm that God sends our way, or it may simply be the consequences of our own choices, a self-created storm. And sometimes it just takes a storm to get your attention and to hear God saying, we need to talk. That's what God was saying to Jonah. Jonah, we need to talk. We need to talk. Stop running. So Jonah gets out of bed, never does say that he prays, even though the captain asked him to. And he joins the rest of the guys up on deck. And so he gets up on deck, and at this point they decide that this is more than just a typical storm. This is more than just a weather pattern. And so they're going to try to figure out what's going on. And so here's what they do, verse 7. Then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. Now, casting lots, that would be like rolling dice or having everybody draw straws and see who got the shortest straw. It's just a superstitious thing that they would do. But God even steps into their superstition and speaks to Jonah in this moment, because it goes on to say this: they cast lots and the lot fell on Jonah. And I can't help but think that at this point, Jonah must have said, oh boy, now I understand. The God I know so well, the God I love so much, the God who loves me is pursuing me. He's trying to get my attention. And so immediately when this happens, they begin to grill him. So they ask him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? I mean, they're giving him the third degree. They're saying, Jonah, come on, man, what is the deal? What happened here? And so Jonah has to give what we in the church world would call a testimony. So here's what he said. He answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land, which, by the way, I should have stayed on. And then he goes on to say this terrified them, and they asked, what have you done? They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? And I want you to stop for a moment and think about this and put yourself in the shoes of these poor sailors. I mean, they were terrified. They had already thrown most of their cargo overboard, which meant they were going to take a huge financial hit. And now they're afraid for their very lives. But think about this. It wasn't because of anything they had done wrong. They were experiencing all of this simply because they took a ticket from a guy and allowed him to get on board their ship, a guy who was running from God, and God was trying to get him back. See, here's what you need to understand. When you run from God, other people in your boat will suffer the consequences. And the story of Jonah is a reminder of the truth that none of us live in isolation, that all of our choices have ripple effects. They all have consequences for the people around us, especially for the people who are closest to us. I mean, this was Jonah's storm, but other people were caught up in it. And you might be in the middle of a storm in your life, maybe a storm that God has sent, maybe a storm that's just of your own making, the natural consequences of your own choices. But chances are there are other people who got caught in your storm with you. And some of you understand this personally because you've been caught in somebody else's storm. I mean, the reason why you come perhaps from a broken home and the reason why maybe you carry so much emotional baggage with you is because you had a mom who couldn't resist the temptation to drink too much. Or you had a dad who couldn't resist the temptation to run around. Or you had a parent who never dealt with their anger issues. And it wasn't your problem. And it wasn't your choice. And it wasn't your storm. You just happened to be in the same boat. And now you're paying the price. See, when we choose to run from God, it's always going to affect the people around us. You know, sometimes people say, this is just between me and this other person or between me and this God. No, it never is. Other people always get caught up in your storm. So go back to verse 11. So they ask him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Now, I had to stop here and ask myself a question. And here's the question I asked myself. What if in this moment, Jonah had knelt down on the deck of that ship, and what if he had prayed, and what if he had said, Lord, please forgive my disobedience. Please spare my life. Please spare the lives of these innocent men. God, I will do what you're calling me to do. I will go to Nineveh. What do you think would have happened if he had prayed a prayer like that? I honestly believe, I believe with all my heart, that the storm would have stopped in that moment if Jonah had prayed a prayer like that sincerely. But here's what he says. He says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. Do you know what Jonah was saying? He was saying, I would rather die than go to Nineveh. I would rather die than do what God is calling me to do. You just throw me into the sea and this whole thing will be over. And what's so fascinating to me is that they don't immediately jump at this chance. Look at verse 13. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land. These sailors are risking their own lives to try to get back to land for the sake of the one who had caused this whole problem to begin with, which is, again, another fascinating contrast. They have more compassion for Jonah than Jonah had for the people of Nineveh. It's almost as if God is even speaking to Jonah through the compassion of these sailors. And maybe Jonah should have been thinking, wow, maybe I should have this much compassion for people that I feel have hurt me like these guys have for me, even though I've caused so much stress for them. But eventually they realize they have no option. It says, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. That must have been fascinating. Like incredible storm. Jonah hits the water, bloop, whew, it's calm. Which explains this. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. And so the entire ship gets converted. God even uses our stupidity to do great things. Now, at this point, at least from a human perspective, it looks like it's over, right? I mean, God tried to get Jonah to go to Nineveh, but Jonah said no. And finally, he just gets himself thrown overboard. And so God lost and Jonah won, right? Wrong. Because when we run from God, he has options that we never even dreamed of. Look at verse 17. It says this, but the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, let me just stop and acknowledge something here. Some of you may have a really hard time with this part of the story, and I get that. You may be thinking to yourself, now certainly, Mark, you don't expect me to believe that a man was swallowed by a fish and actually lived to tell about it. I mean, how is that even possible? Certainly, this has to be nothing but a myth. And I get that. But there are a number of reasons, I'll tell you why I have no problem believing this part of the story. And honestly, I could spend the next 20 minutes giving you a list of reasons. Let me just give you the biggest reason why I don't have any trouble believing this. And it's simply this. If you believe in God at all, if you believe in a God who could set this world into motion, if you believe in a God who created life, then you should have no trouble believing in a God who could make it possible for a man to live in the belly of a fish for 3 days and then for the fish to, on command, puke him up. I mean, he's God. He can do that. I mean, think of it this way. We've created a way for a group of people to live underwater for months at a time. We call it a submarine, right? So if God could create us and we could create a submarine to keep a group of people alive underwater, then certainly God could create a way for a fish to keep a man underwater alive for just a few days. If you really believe God is God, then this is not much of a stretch. So it says here, the Lord provided a great fish. We don't know what kind of fish. It may have been a custom created fish just for this moment. But here's what I want you to understand about the fish. This was not punishment. This was grace. This was a second chance. The fish was an amphibious rescue vehicle. Now, don't get me wrong, this had to have been a horrible, horrible experience. I mean, if I had to make a list of all the places in the world where you would not want to spend 3 days, belly of a fish would be at the top of the list, right? I'm sure it was dark. I'm sure it was slimy. I'm sure it probably smelled like a porta-john at a county fair. It was horrible. And yet at the same time, it was really good. Because here's what happened in that place. I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 2, verse 1, and we'll continue in chapter 2 next week. It says this, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed, and I might put Jonah finally prayed to the Lord his God. Because now God has Jonah's undivided attention. And it was in that awful place that God begins to really work on Jonah's heart. See, the fish was not retribution. It was restoration. That was not God's way of paying Jonah back. That was God's way of bringing Jonah back. And the truth is, sometimes we have to hit bottom before we look up. We have to feel some pain before really God gets our undivided attention. And my friend, the pain that you're going through right now, that may be God's grace in your life. He may be allowing that pain just to bring you back to Him. That may not be true. Some of the pain we feel in life is just the result of living in a broken, fallen world, but sometimes the pain we feel is the consequence of our own choices, and sometimes it's in those painful moments that we really turn and see God for who He really is. Whenever we do baptisms around here, we always give people the chance to tell their spiritual journey story, and so many times So many times when people tell their story, it goes something like this. It was when the bottom fell out of my life. It was when things got really bad. It was when she walked away. It was when the business fell apart. That's when I really turned to God. And the pain in your life right now, that may be God's grace. He may be either allowing that pain or orchestrating that pain. And if you're running from God right now, then behind the seemingly random circumstances of your life may be the whispers of God just calling you back and calling you to turn around and come home. So you can run from God, but you can't outrun God. So Jonah's story doesn't end there, obviously. We're going to pick up again next week. But let me end just by saying a couple of things. Number one, let me say this. It's never too late to stop running from God. It's never too late to stop running from God, because in God's eyes, no one is too sinful, too scarred, too screwed up, or too far away. And I don't know how long you've been running or where you've run or how deep you've gone, but it's never too late in God's grace to turn around and run in the opposite direction. But let me tell you something else as well. It's never too soon to stop running from God. Because the farther you run and the longer you run, the more painful your life gets, the more time you lose, and the more people that you hurt. And your Father in heaven loves you, and He will do whatever it takes to get you back because He loves you that much. Let me say it one more time. You can run from God, but you cannot outrun God. None of us can. You know, it's very interesting to me that the Jewish people have a tradition, even today, that continues every year. On Yom Kippur, in Jewish synagogues all over the world, the book of Jonah is read in its entirety. And after it's read, the people all stand up and they say together in unison, "I am Jonah." And that is such a great picture, because you are Jonah, I am Jonah, we are Jonah. We struggle every day to do what God is calling us to do. And sometimes we downright refuse, and instead of going to Nineveh, we run to Tarshish. We say, "God, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to go my own way," and we run. And when Jonah was running, you know, God pursued him, and He tried repeatedly to get his attention. He reached out to him. He spoke to him through a storm. He spoke to him through the words of the captain of that ship. He spoke to him through the superstition of casting lots. He spoke to Jonah even through the compassion of the sailors on that ship who tried to save him, and eventually he got his undivided attention when He had him in the belly of a fish. So here's my question. How is God speaking to you today? Are you willing to listen? Will you stop running? Will you turn around and come home?